My parents told me they were too heartbroken and devastated to attend my 7-year-old daughter's funeral. They swore the grief was physically destroying them. But exactly 3 days later, they stood in my living room, looking me dead in the eye, coldly demanding I hand over her $2 million medical trust fund to pay for my brother's lavish country club wedding. My father crossed his arms and said, "She is gone, Sarah, but your brother still has a future." They thought I was too broken by grief to fight back. They thought I would just sign the papers and disappear. But they didn't know I had found Lily's iPad, and they certainly didn't expect me to play her final recording in front of 150 of their high society friends. Before I tell you what they said on that recording, and how I took everything from them, please take a moment to like and subscribe if you believe that being family does not give anyone the right to exploit you. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from right now and what time it is there. I love connecting with you all. Now, let me take you back to the day my entire world stopped turning. My name is Sarah. I am 32 years old, a freelance accountant, and a widow. But more than anything else, I was a mother to a beautiful, brave 7-year-old girl named Lily. I say was because on a freezing Tuesday in November, I stood in the pouring Chicago rain at a small, quiet cemetery, watching a wooden casket being lowered into the earth. The cold rain soaked right through my thin black wool coat, chilling me to the bone, but I barely felt it. I was numb. The kind of absolute hollow numbness that only comes after you have spent years fighting a losing battle. My husband passed away when Lily was just a baby, leaving us with nothing but a life insurance policy and each other. Then, the medical nightmares began. A devastating misdiagnosis, endless hospital stays, and a grueling medical malpractice lawsuit that eventually resulted in a $2 million trust fund. But that money was locked strictly into a medical trust for Lily's care. It was not wealth, it was survival. And in the end, it was not enough to save her. I stood by that open grave, my legs trembling from exhaustion. I had not slept a full night in 3 years. My life had been reduced to balancing my accounting clients on a laptop in harsh fluorescent hospital rooms, listening to the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors, praying for a miracle that never arrived. And as I stood there saying my final goodbye to my only child, I looked around the small gathering of people holding umbrellas. There were only about 10 of them. A few of my older accounting clients who had known my struggles. 3 incredible nurses from the pediatric oncology ward who had loved Lily like their own. A social worker who had helped me navigate the impossible paperwork. But there were 2 glaring absences. 2 people who absolutely should have been standing right beside me, holding my hand, sharing my unimaginable grief. My parents, Richard and Susan. They lived less than an hour away in a wealthy, pristine suburb of Chicago. They were prominent members of their local church and fixtures at their exclusive country club. They possessed the resources, the time, and the means to be there. They could have paid for an enormous, beautiful floral arrangement. They could have organized a grand reception. Instead, the area around the grave was barren. There were no expensive wreaths, no sprawling bouquets of white lilies, just the relentless drumming rain and the gray sky. I remember looking at the empty space beside me and feeling a fresh wave of tears mix with the rain on my face. I did not feel anger at that moment. I only felt a deep, profound pity for them, because, as always, I had found a way to justify their actions. I had spent my entire life making excuses for Richard and Susan. Just a few hours before the funeral, my phone had vibrated on my kitchen counter. It was my mother. When I answered, her voice was a theatrical, breathless whisper. She was weeping hysterically, taking loud, gasping breaths, as if she were the one physically suffering. Sarah, she had sobbed into the receiver. "I cannot breathe. My chest is so tight. The grief is just too much to bear. My blood pressure is spiking dangerously high, and the doctor says if I subject myself to the emotional trauma of a funeral, I might have a severe stroke." "I am so sorry, Sarah. Your father has to stay here to monitor my heart and take care of me. We simply cannot be there. We are too broken." I had stood in my kitchen, wearing my black dress, holding the phone with a trembling hand, and I had comforted her. I, the mother who had just lost her only child, had comforted my mother for not coming to the funeral. "It is okay, Mom," I had whispered, swallowing down the massive lump in my throat. "I understand. Please take care of yourself. Lily knows you love her. Do not risk your health." I hung up the phone and convinced myself that their absence was a product of overwhelming love. I told myself that they were simply an older generation unequipped to handle the visceral tragedy of burying a grandchild. I rationalized that their country club lifestyle and their obsession with perfect appearances made them fragile when faced with real, ugly, messy reality. As the eternal peacemaker of the family, I accepted my role. I was the strong one. I was the reliable one. I was the one who could shoulder the burden alone, so they did not have to. Growing up, I had always been the practical daughter. While my older brother Bradley was the golden child, the handsome, charismatic son who was constantly bailed out of trouble and showered with praise, I was the quiet worker in the background. I was the one who managed the details, solved the problems, and asked for nothing. It made perfect sense to my exhausted mind that even in my darkest hour, I was still expected to be the one who handled the heavy lifting alone. I truly believed they were sitting in their large, perfectly decorated suburban home, holding each other and weeping for my daughter. When the cemetery service concluded, the priest offered a final prayer, and the small group of nurses and co-workers offered me their quiet condolences before heading back to their cars. I stayed behind for a few more minutes. I watched the rain hit the polished wood of the casket. I whispered a final promise to Lily that I would carry her in my heart until my very last breath. Then I turned and walked back to my 10-year-old car. The drive home was a blur of gray highways and sweeping windshield wipers. When I finally turned the key in the lock of my front door, the silence of the house hit me like a physical blow. For years, this house had been filled with the sounds of medical machines, the hum of oxygen concentrators, the quiet voices of home care nurses, and the sweet, weak voice of my daughter asking for a story. Now, there was nothing. Just a suffocating, heavy emptiness that pressed down on my chest until I could barely draw breath. I took off my wet coat and dropped it on the floor. I walked down the short hallway and stopped at the doorway of Lily's bedroom. I had not changed a single thing since the ambulance took her away. Her bed was still unmade. Her favorite stuffed animals were perfectly lined up against the pillows. On the small reading chair in the corner lay her favorite dress. It was a soft, pale yellow cotton dress with little embroidered daisies along the hem. I had bought it for her, hoping she would be well enough to wear it for her 8th birthday next spring. I walked over to the chair and picked up the dress. I pressed the fabric against my face and inhaled deeply. It still smelled faintly of her baby shampoo and the sterile, sharp scent of hospital hand sanitizer. That was when my legs finally gave out. I collapsed onto the floor of her bedroom, clutching that small yellow dress to my chest, and I screamed. I wept until my throat was raw. I wept for the future that had been stolen from her. I wept for the lonely meals I would eat for the rest of my life. I wept for the sheer crushing unfairness of it all. And through all those tears, I still held a space in my heart for my parents. I genuinely believed that Richard and Susan were sharing this exact same agony miles away. I pictured my mother lying in bed, overcome with physical distress from a broken heart. I pictured my father silently grieving the grandchild he claimed to adore. My empathy for them was deep and unwavering. I felt no resentment that I was alone on this floor. I accepted it as my duty to shield them from the ugliest parts of this tragedy. I curled up on the rug, surrounded by the remnants of my daughter's short life, and allowed the exhaustion to finally pull me into a deep, dreamless sleep. I did not know it then, but that was the very last time I would ever feel an ounce of sympathy for my parents. I did not know that their tears on the phone had been a calculated performance. I did not know that, while I was standing in the freezing rain, watching my child being buried, they were perfectly healthy, eagerly planning a celebration. My empathy, my endless capacity for understanding, and my lifetime of making excuses for their behavior would soon be brutally and permanently extinguished. The peacemaker inside me was about to die, and a very different woman was about to take her place. Because exactly 72 hours later, the doorbell would ring, and my parents would walk into my living room to make a demand so vile, so entirely devoid of human decency, that it would force me to burn my entire family to the ground. Exactly 72 hours after I watched my daughter being lowered into the cold Chicago earth. The doorbell broke the suffocating silence of my house. I was sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by condolence cards I could not bring myself to open. I had not showered in days. I was wearing the same oversized gray sweatpants and faded college shirt I had slept in since the funeral. When the chime echoed through the hallway, my heart gave a sudden, desperate leap. I thought of the weeping phone call my mother had made. I told myself that they had finally gathered the strength to face this tragedy. I truly believed my parents had come to hold me, to apologize for their absence, and to mourn the granddaughter they had claimed to love so much. I pulled myself up from the floor, my legs heavy and aching, and walked to the front door. When I turned the deadbolt and pulled the heavy wooden door open, my breath caught in my throat. Standing on my front porch were my father, Richard, my mother, Susan, and my older brother, Bradley. They did not look like a family destroyed by grief. They looked like they were stepping out of a luxury lifestyle magazine. My father wore a crisp navy blue suit that fit his shoulders perfectly. My mother was wrapped in a pristine cream-colored cashmere coat, her blonde hair flawlessly blown out, her makeup immaculate. The scent of her expensive floral perfume instantly masked the stale, sterile smell of my hallway. Bradley stood slightly behind them in a tailored blazer, checking a notification on his phone before bothering to look up at me. There was a stark, jarring contrast between their polished perfection and my ruined state. But my exhausted mind, still desperate for maternal comfort, pushed that thought aside. I opened the door wider and stepped back, murmuring a quiet greeting, inviting them inside. They stepped into the foyer and followed me into the living room. The room was practically a shrine to Lily. Her medical equipment had been removed, but her presence was everywhere. Her framed school pictures sat on the mantel. Her favorite coloring books were still neatly stacked on the coffee table. I watched my parents carefully, waiting for their eyes to soften, waiting for the tears my mother had sworn were destroying her health just 3 days ago. But Susan did not look at the photos. She looked at the dust on the baseboards. She smoothed her cashmere coat before sitting on the very edge of my sofa, crossing her legs at the ankles. Richard sat beside her, resting his hands on his knees. Bradley remained standing near the entryway, shifting his weight impatiently. The silence in the room was not a grieving silence. It was a business silence. It was the tense, calculated quiet of people preparing to negotiate. I sat in the armchair across from them, folding my hands in my lap, waiting for someone to speak first. I waited for an apology. I waited for them to say Lily's name. My father cleared his throat. He looked at me with a steady, unreadable expression. He did not ask how I was sleeping. He did not ask if I had eaten. He simply said, "We have a situation, Sarah, and we need your help to fix it." I blinked, thoroughly confused. A situation. My mind struggled to process the word. What situation could possibly matter right now? Your brother's wedding is just a few months away. Richard continued, his voice taking on the authoritative, booming tone he used to lecture contractors at his firm. As you know, Chloe's family has very specific expectations. The ceremony at the Oak Brook Country Club is already stretching our resources. The floral arrangements, the custom catering, the live orchestra. It is an event that represents our family's standing in the community. I stared at him, feeling a strange ringing start in my ears. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. I could not comprehend what was happening. My child had been dead for less than a week. The dirt on her grave was still wet, and my father was sitting in my living room, complaining about the cost of floral arrangements and an orchestra at a country club. Bradley stepped forward, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. Chloe's parents are starting to ask questions, Sarah. You know how old money families are. They want to ensure I bring equal value into the marriage. They are demanding proof of assets before we sign the prenuptial agreement. If I cannot show a substantial net worth, they are going to force Chloe to call off the wedding. It would be a complete humiliation for all of us. The ringing in my ears grew louder. I looked from Bradley to my father, and then to my mother. Susan was watching me intently, nodding in agreement with everything her son said. I am sorry, I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly frail. I do not understand why you are telling me this. I do not have anything to do with Bradley's wedding. I am barely surviving right now. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, bringing his face closer to mine. The mask of polite concern dropped completely. We are telling you this because you are the only one who can solve the problem, Sarah. The medical trust fund. The $2 million from the malpractice settlement and the insurance. We need you to transfer those funds into a joint family trust immediately. The air in the living room simply vanished. I felt as though I had been physically struck in the chest. That money was the result of a grueling, soul-crushing legal battle after a hospital's negligence destroyed my daughter's health. Every single dollar in that trust represented a day of Lily's suffering. It represented the agonizing treatments, the nights I slept on a hard plastic chair beside her hospital bed, the tears she cried when the pain became too much. The money was sacred. It was legally and morally designated for one purpose only: to keep my daughter comfortable. With Lily gone, the law dictated I was the sole beneficiary, but I had not even thought about the money. I would have gladly burned every last cent just to hear her laugh one more time. And now, 72 hours after I buried her, my father was asking for it to fund a country club wedding. I shook my head slowly, unable to process the absolute depravity of the request. You want Lily's medical trust to pay for Bradley's wedding? I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Richard sighed deeply, clearly annoyed by my lack of immediate compliance. He sat up straight, crossed his arms over his chest, and looked me dead in the eye. He delivered his next words with a cold, terrifying precision that I will remember until the day I die. Lily is gone, Sarah. That money is useless sitting there. Your brother needs to buy a starter estate to match Chloe's family. Those words slammed into me with the force of a freight train. Lily is gone. He said it with the same casual indifference one might use to announce that a television show had been canceled. There was no sorrow. There was no mourning. There was only a calculated assessment of available assets. In my father's eyes, my daughter's death was not a tragedy. It was a liquidity event. It was an opportunity to free up capital for the son who actually mattered. A deep, paralyzing disgust washed over me. It started in my stomach and radiated out to my fingertips. The profound empathy I had felt for them at the cemetery evaporated, entirely replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I had spent 32 years making excuses for these people. I had accepted the leftover birthday cakes, the forgotten milestones, the blatant favoritism. But this was different. This was a violation of my child's memory. I looked at my mother. I searched her face for any sign of maternal instinct, any hint of the heartbreak she had claimed on the phone. Susan, I said, hoping against all reason that she would intervene. Tell me he is joking. Tell me you did not come here to ask me for my dead child's pain money. Susan did not flinch. She sat perfectly still, her blue eyes hard and unyielding. Your father is right, Sarah. The money is just sitting in a bank account. Bradley is building a future. He is bringing prestige to the Myers family name. Transferring the funds under the guise of a family contribution will avoid massive tax penalties, and it will secure your brother's position with Chloe's parents. It is the logical thing to do, no, I said. The word hung in the air. It was a quiet word, but it carried the weight of absolute finality. Richard uncrossed his arms, his face darkening with anger. Excuse me. I said no. I repeated, my voice growing stronger, fueled by the rage that was finally burning away my grief. I am not giving you a single dime. That money belongs to Lily. It is the result of her suffering. You will not touch it. Bradley will not touch it. I will not fund a country club party with the settlement from my daughter's ruined life. Get out of my house. The room erupted. Bradley threw his hands up in the air, cursing loudly, pacing back and forth near the hallway. Are you kidding me right now? He shouted. You are going to ruin my life over a dead kid's bank account. You do not even need the money. You sit in this depressing little house all day. I have a reputation to maintain. But it was Susan who delivered the most vicious blow. She stood up from the sofa, smoothing her pristine coat, her face contorted with a venomous rage I had never seen directed at me before. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. You have always been selfish, she hissed, her voice vibrating with malice. This family is in crisis. Bradley's entire future is on the line. Our reputation is on the line. Are you going to hoard that money and die miserable and alone? You have nothing left, Sarah. No husband, no child. We are the only family you have. If you turn your back on us now, do not ever expect us to be there for you again. I stood up slowly, facing the woman who gave birth to me. The irony of her threat was almost suffocating. "You were not there for me 3 days ago," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifying calm. "You claimed you were too broken by grief to attend your own granddaughter's funeral. But you are standing here right now, perfectly healthy, perfectly dressed, screaming at me for cash." Richard stepped between me and my mother, his jaw set in a hard line. "You are making a massive mistake, Sarah. You are letting your emotions cloud your financial judgment. We are going to give you 24 hours to think about this. If you do not sign the transfer papers by tomorrow evening, we are done with you. You will be completely cut off from this family." They did not wait for my response. Richard turned and walked toward the front door. Susan followed him, her chin held high in indignant fury. Bradley lingered for just a second, glaring at me with absolute hatred, before turning on his heel and following our parents out the door. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing violently through the empty house. I stood in the center of the living room for a long time, listening to the engine of my father's luxury sedan roar to life and fade away down the street. The house was silent again, but the air felt contaminated. The sheer audacity of their demand, the absolute lack of humanity, pressed down on my chest until my knees buckled. I collapsed back onto the floor, pulling my knees to my chest, struggling to draw oxygen into my lungs. My parents did not love me. They did not love Lily. They only loved what we could provide for their precious golden son. I sat there on the rug for nearly an hour, letting the shock wash over me in freezing waves. When the trembling finally stopped, a new desperate need took hold of me. I needed to move. I needed to do something with my hands to stop my mind from replaying my father's cruel words. I pushed myself off the floor and walked down the hallway to the utility closet. Sitting on the floor of the closet were the hospital bags. 2 large canvas duffel bags filled with the items I had hastily packed on the day Lily passed away. I had shoved them in there, unable to face unpacking the final remnants of her hospital room, now needing a distraction from the betrayal of my own parents. I dragged the heavy bags out into the hallway and unzipped the first one. The smell of sterile wipes and hospital linens drifted up from the canvas. I reached inside, mechanically pulling out folded blankets, half-empty boxes of crayons, and soft cotton pajamas. My hands were moving, automatically sorting the items into piles on the hardwood floor. I reached deep into the side pocket of the second duffel bag, my fingers brushing against cold metal and smooth glass. I pulled out Lily's iPad. The screen was smudged with tiny fingerprints. I held it in my hands, a sudden desperate urge washing over me to see her face, to hear her voice just one more time. I pressed the power button. The screen illuminated the dim hallway. The battery was critically low, but the device booted up. I swiped the screen, intending to open her photo gallery. But the iPad opened directly to the last application that had been running before it was shoved into the bag. It opened to the voice memo application. There was a file sitting at the top of the list. It was dated for the exact morning Lily had passed away, marked with a timestamp from the very hour I had left the room to find her attending physician. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I tapped the play button, completely unaware that the audio, filling my silent hallway, was about to hand me the exact weapon I needed to destroy my family forever. My fingers traced the cold aluminum edge of Lily's iPad. It was sitting right there at the top of the canvas bag, but my hand hovered over it, unable to pick it up. This iPad had been my daughter's entire world during those final grueling months in the pediatric oncology ward. When she was too weak to walk down the hall to the hospital playroom, she would sit in her bed and create little digital masterpieces. She loved to draw brightly colored animals and record herself telling elaborate stories about them. But she had another habit too. Whenever I had to step out of the room to speak with a doctor or grab a cup of awful cafeteria coffee, Lily would hit the record button. She told me she was making secret diaries for me to find later. She would whisper jokes into the microphone or sing fragments of songs she had learned from her favorite nurses. I cherished those recordings. They were tiny windows into the beautiful, unbroken spirit of my little girl. Finding this device in the utility closet, 3 days after her funeral, felt like discovering a hidden treasure. I desperately needed to hear her sweet voice again. I needed to close my eyes and pretend she was still sitting in her hospital bed asking me for a glass of apple juice. The battery icon flashed a red warning, indicating it was about to die completely. I scrambled to find a charger in the duffel bag, my hands shaking so violently I dropped the cable twice. Once it was plugged into the wall, I sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor of my hallway, leaning my back against the wall. The screen illuminated my face, casting a pale glow in the dark corridor. I stared at the file name in the voice memo application. The system had automatically generated a title based on the date and time. It was a Tuesday, November 12th, 10:14 in the morning. My breath hitched in my throat as my mind registered that specific timestamp. I remembered 10:14 on that Tuesday morning with agonizing clarity. It was the exact moment Lily's vital monitors had started blaring their shrill, terrifying alarms. Her heart rate had plummeted, and her breathing had become incredibly shallow. I had panicked. I had sprinted out of the room and raced down the long linoleum hallway, screaming for her, attending physician. I was gone for exactly 12 minutes. 12 minutes of sheer blinding terror, while the medical team rushed past me into her room. That was the beginning of the end. She passed away just a few hours later. If this recording started at 10:14, it meant Lily had managed to press the record button right as I ran out the door. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Was this her saying goodbye to me? Was this her final message before the monitors went off? I braced myself for the sound of her struggling to breathe. I prepared my heart to shatter into a million irreparable pieces. I tapped the screen. The video went completely black. For a second, I thought the device had finally died, but the audio progress bar at the bottom of the screen was moving steadily forward. The iPad was not broken. It had simply been placed face down on the hospital bed, blocking the camera lens. I pulled my knees tightly to my chest and held the iPad close to my ear, waiting for my daughter's voice. There was no sweet voice. There was no singing. There was only the heavy rustling sound of fabric shifting, followed by the distinct click of the heavy hospital door closing. Footsteps moved quickly across the linoleum floor, right up to the edge of Lily's bed. I frowned, leaning in closer. Then a voice broke the static silence. It was not a child. It was a woman. It was a voice I had known for 32 years. "Did you close the door completely, Richard?" It was my mother. Susan. Her tone was sharp and impatient, lacking any trace of the maternal warmth she performed for her country club friends. "Yes, it is shut." My father's voice answered low and gravelly. "Keep your voice down, Susan. Someone could walk by. Where is Sarah?" She ran down to the nurse's station like a lunatic. My mother replied, her voice dripping with sheer annoyance. "The monitors are going off. The doctor told me outside that there is nothing more they can do. He says the brat only has a few hours left at most." I stopped breathing. The air simply vanished from my lungs. The brat. My mother, the woman who had wept on the phone about how much she loved her granddaughter, had just referred to my dying 7-year-old child as a brat. I sat frozen on my hallway floor, paralyzed by a horror so deep it felt like a physical weight crushing my spine. The recording continued, perfectly capturing the sound of a cell phone dialing and ringing on speakerphone. A man answered on the second ring. It was my brother Bradley. "Mom, what is going on?" Bradley asked, his voice sounding bored and slightly out of breath. "I am at the golf course." "Listen to me carefully, Bradley." My mother said, her voice vibrating with a sickening, eager energy. "The doctor says she only has a few hours left. It is finally happening. You need to go ahead and put the non-refundable deposits down on the florist and the ballroom right now. Do not wait another day. Chloe's parents are breathing down our necks for the financial proof, and we are out of time." "Are you sure?" Bradley asked. "If I write this check and the money does not come through, the bank will bounce it, and Chloe's dad will cancel the wedding immediately." "I am positive." My father interjected, stepping closer to the iPad. "Once she dies, that $2 million is ours. Sarah is completely falling apart. She is barely sleeping, and she can hardly string 2 sentences together. She is so weak right now. Getting her to sign the power of attorney over the trust fund will be a breeze. We will tell her it is to handle the legal paperwork, so she can focus on grieving. She trusts us completely." Just secure the venue, Bradley. The money is basically in our accounts already. All right, I will wire the deposit to the country club today, Bradley replied, sounding relieved. Finally, we can move forward. Call me when it is over. The call disconnected. I heard my parents shuffling their feet. Look at her, Richard. My mother whispered, her voice dripping with disgust. All these years and all this money wasted on hospital bills. We should have had access to that medical trust from the beginning. It is ridiculous that a child gets $2 million while your own son faces financial ruin. Let us get out into the waiting room before Sarah comes back. We need to look like we have been crying. The heavy door clicked open and then shut again. The recording captured a few more minutes of static silence before cutting off completely. I did not cry. I did not scream. The agonizing grief that had consumed me for the past week, the heavy, suffocating sadness that had kept me unbathed and crying on the floor, simply evaporated. It was gone. In its place, a terrifying, ice-cold rage began to spread through my veins. It started in the pit of my stomach and crawled all the way up to my throat, leaving a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. My hands stopped shaking. I set the iPad down on the floor with absolute, deliberate precision. I stared at the dark screen as the reality of what I had just heard rearranged the entire landscape of my life. My parents had stood over my dying child's bed, not to say goodbye, but to count the money they planned to steal from her corpse. They had listened to the alarms signaling the end of her short, painful life and treated it like a winning lottery ticket. They had called her a brat while she lay unconscious, taking her final breaths. The performance they had given me, the weeping phone calls, the claims that their blood pressure was spiking from unbearable sorrow, all of it was a grotesque theatrical act. They had skipped the funeral, not because they were grieving, but because they were busy securing non-refundable deposits for a country club party using money they planned to extort from me. They believed I was weak. They believed my devastation made me an easy target. They thought my love for Lily and my desperate need for parental comfort would blind me to their ultimate betrayal. I stood up from the hallway floor. My legs did not ache anymore. I walked into the bathroom and turned on the harsh overhead light. I looked at the woman in the mirror. She had dark circles under her eyes and tangled, unwashed hair, but the profound vulnerability that had defined her for years was dead and buried. The peacemaker, the obedient daughter who always justified her parents' cruelty, the woman who accepted marked-down birthday cakes and constant emotional neglect, was gone. My parents had killed her when they stood in that hospital room and plotted to steal my dead child's legacy. A mother's protective instinct does not disappear when her child dies. It transforms. It hardens into something sharp and unforgiving. They had violated the sanctity of Lily's final moments. They had looked at my baby girl and seen nothing but a bank account. I was going to make them pay for that. I was going to dismantle their lives piece by piece. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of cold water, drinking it down in one long gulp. My mind began to race, operating with the clinical, detached precision of a seasoned accountant. The grief was pushed into a locked box in the back of my mind. The numbers, the facts, the legal implications took the front seat. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. Why were they so desperate? This was the question that burned brightly in my newly sharpened mind. Richard and Susan lived in an expensive Chicago suburb. They drove luxury cars and boasted about their pristine credit to anyone who would listen at their church. They held a prestigious membership at the Oak Brook Country Club. Why would people with seemingly endless resources risk committing massive financial fraud to steal a medical trust fund? Why was Bradley terrified that a single check to a florist would bounce? Why were Chloe's parents demanding proof of assets? People who have millions of dollars do not pace around hospital rooms, waiting for a 7-year-old to die so they can pay for a wedding. People who are financially secure do not plot to trick their grieving daughter into signing a power of attorney. This level of moral depravity was born of sheer, unadulterated desperation. They were hiding something massive. There was a crack in their perfect upper-middle-class facade, and I was going to find it. I cracked my knuckles and opened a new browser tab, pulling up the county public records database. It was time to look closely at my parents' financial history. It was time to find out exactly how much debt they were drowning in. I sat at my small kitchen table, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. The tears that had stained my cheeks just moments ago were completely gone, dried up by the searing heat of absolute betrayal. In my entire life, I had never felt a focus as sharp and diamond hard as the one settling over me now. My parents had looked at my dead daughter and seen a bank transfer. They thought my grief made me a vulnerable target, but they forgot one very important detail about who they were dealing with. I was an accountant, and numbers, unlike people, do not lie. Years ago, before Lily got sick, I used to do my parents' taxes. I knew their social security numbers, I knew their banking histories, I knew the intricate web of accounts they used to maintain their pristine country club image. They had always been obsessed with looking wealthy. Susan with her designer coats, and Richard with his custom golf clubs. But true wealth does not operate in a panic. True wealth does not count the hours until a 7-year-old dies to fund a wedding. I opened a secure browser window and navigated to the county clerk public records database. I did not need a private investigator. Everything I needed was publicly available if you knew exactly where to look and how to follow the paper trail. I started with their property. The grand suburban house in Oak Brook that my mother treated like a royal palace. The house where I had grown up, feeling like a ghost in the background of Bradley's golden child existence. I typed in the property address and pulled the deed history. The initial load screen took 3 seconds, but in those 3 seconds, my mind was racing. If they were hiding a financial crisis, it would start with the house. The page refreshed and a long list of recorded documents appeared. I scrolled past the original purchase deed from 30 years ago, past the standard refinancing records from the early 2000s. Then I found it. A document filed just 18 months ago, a massive second mortgage. I clicked on the document image and leaned in close to read the fine print. My father had taken out a second mortgage for $800,000 against the equity of the house. I felt my eyebrows knit together in deep concentration. $800,000 is not a sum you borrow to maintain a country club membership. That is the kind of money you borrow to stop a sinking ship. I needed to know where that money went. I opened another tab and searched for business filings in the state of Illinois under my father's name and my brother's name. It did not take long. The search results lit up with a string of registered limited liability companies, all tied to Bradley. Bradley, the brilliant entrepreneur. Bradley, the son who could do no wrong. Bradley, who was always full of grand ideas that required someone else to fund them. There was a luxury auto detailing business that dissolved 3 years ago. There was a boutique marketing firm that barely lasted 8 months. And then there was the most recent one. A high-end real estate investment group that had been slapped with multiple liens and massive tax penalties. I cross-referenced the dates of Bradley's business filings with the date my father took out the second mortgage. They matched perfectly. Richard had leveraged his entire life to bail out Bradley's spectacular failures. He had drained every ounce of equity from the family home to keep his golden boy from declaring bankruptcy, and it had not worked. Bradley's investment group was currently listed as inactive and heavily in debt to several private creditors. I sat back in my chair, running my hands over my face. The sheer scale of their financial ruin was breathtaking. The perfectly tailored suits, the cashmere coats, the casual talk about expensive floral arrangements, all of it was a counterfeit reality. They were living on the edge of a cliff. Every single day was a performance masking a mountain of toxic debt. But still, $800,000 did not explain the desperate manic need for Lily's $2 million trust fund. They could declare bankruptcy. They could sell the house and downsize. People do it every day. Why risk a massive ethical and legal violation to steal a medical trust? What was the absolute immediate urgency? The answer came when I looked closer at the timeline of Bradley's relationship. He had started dating Chloe exactly 1 year ago. Chloe came from a formidable family. Her father was a highly successful corporate lawyer, and her mother sat on the board of half the charities in Chicago. They were old money. The kind of people who investigated their future sons-in-law before allowing a marriage to proceed. I opened a new search and began digging into the legal requirements for high net worth prenuptial agreements in our state. Then I remembered the specific phrase Bradley had used in the living room earlier. He had said Chloe's parents were demanding proof of assets before signing the prenuptial agreement. He said they wanted to ensure he brought equal value into the marriage. Suddenly, all the jagged pieces of the puzzle slammed together into one horrifying, clear picture. Bradley had lied to Chloe's family. He had presented himself as a highly successful real estate investor with a massive personal net worth. He had likely bragged about a $2 million liquid asset portfolio to match Chloe's trust fund, but that money did not exist. His businesses were dead, and his father was buried in a second mortgage just to keep the lights on. Chloe's father, being a shrewd lawyer, was refusing to let the wedding proceed or sign any prenuptial documents until Bradley provided hard, irrefutable proof of those $2 million sitting in a bank account. Without that proof, the lie would be exposed. The wealthy in-laws would realize Bradley was a fraud, drowning in debt. The wedding, the social elevation. My mother craved the financial rescue my father desperately needed. All of it would be instantly destroyed. And if the wedding was canceled, Richard and Susan would be left holding the bag for Bradley's debts without the influx of cash or the safety net of a wealthy marriage. The bank would foreclose on the Oak Brook house. They would lose their country club membership. They would lose their social standing in the church. They would be exposed as complete frauds to everyone they knew. Lily's trust fund was not just extra cash to them. It was exactly $2 million. The exact amount Bradley needed to prove his fake net worth to his future father-in-law. My daughter's suffering was the literal lifeline they intended to use to save themselves from total ruin. I stared at the glowing screen, the numbers burning themselves into my retinas. The depth of their depravity was almost impossible to fathom. My own mother and father, the people who had brought me into this world, had sat in a hospital room watching my precious daughter take her final breaths, and all they saw was a bank deposit that could save their sinking ship. They did not see a grieving mother. They saw an obstacle standing between them and $2 million. I pulled up the bank records for my own accounts to check the current status of the trust. The money was sitting safely in a highly restricted account. As the sole surviving beneficiary after Lily's passing, the funds legally belonged entirely to me. But the legal process required formal transfer documents and a power of attorney if anyone else were to manage or absorb those funds. That is why they had come to my house today. They needed my signature. They needed me to willingly hand over the keys to the vault. I thought about the sheer arrogance of their plan. They actually believed that I was so broken, so desperate for their love and approval, that I would blindly sign away my daughter's legacy just to keep the peace. They thought my lifelong habit of making excuses for them would extend even to this. They relied on my silence. They depended on my submission. For 32 years, they had been right. I had always been the quiet one. I had always taken the leftover cake. I had always accepted their dismissals, but the woman who used to accept those things died the moment I heard that audio recording on the iPad. The woman sitting at this kitchen table was a mother who had just buried her child and discovered that the very people who should have mourned with her were planning to rob the grave. My cell phone buzzed violently against the wooden table, shattering the quiet concentration of my kitchen. The screen lit up with a text message from my mother. "Sarah, we know you are hurting, but we need to handle this today. Bradley has a meeting with the wedding planner tomorrow, and we must have the financial documentation ready. Do not let your emotions ruin your brother's life. Please be reasonable and call your father back." I stared at the message. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it made me laugh. A cold, harsh sound that echoed off the kitchen walls. It was a laugh utterly devoid of humor. 5 minutes later, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was from Richard. "Sarah, I have the power of attorney documents drafted. I am emailing them to you now. Review them and let us know when we can come over to collect the physical signatures. We are family. We have to stick together in tough times. Do the right thing here. Do the right thing." The phrase tasted like ash in my mouth. I wanted to scream. I wanted to pick up the phone, call them, and play Lily's recording at maximum volume. I wanted to hear them panic when they realized they had been caught. I wanted to confront them right now and tell them I knew exactly how bankrupt they truly were. But as my hand hovered over the phone, my professional instincts took completely over. Confronting them now would be a release of anger, but it would not be true justice. If I simply told them no and exposed the recording, they would deny it. Susan would cry and claim the audio was misunderstood. Richard would spin a tale of being misquoted. Bradley would play the victim. They would retreat into their wealthy suburban bubble, play the role of the tragic grandparents whose grieving daughter had lost her mind, and they would probably find another way to manipulate someone else to save their skins. No. A simple confrontation was entirely too easy for them. If I was going to do this, I was going to do it right. I was going to dismantle their entire facade in front of the very people they were so desperate to impress. I was going to let them believe they had won right up until the final terrifying moment. I would build a trap, so flawless, so legally ironclad, and so publicly devastating that they would never be able to recover their reputations or their finances. I looked back at the glowing screen of my laptop, mapping out the variables of this new equation. They needed a legally binding document showing that Bradley had access to $2 million. They needed it to satisfy Chloe's father, the high-powered lawyer. They needed it to keep the bank from foreclosing on their home. They needed my signature. I placed my hands flat on the table, taking a long, slow breath. The panic and grief were completely gone now, replaced by a chilling, calculating calm. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. I was going to give them a signature on a document, but it would not be the document Richard had drafted. It would be a document of my own creation. A financial snare designed by an accountant who knew exactly how to bury a fraudulent business. I ignored the barrage of text messages lighting up my phone. Let them sweat for a little while. Let their desperation simmer. I opened a fresh Word document on my laptop and titled it Investment Advance Agreement. If they wanted to play games with high finance, I would play along. My parents had assumed I was a weak, grieving widow who knew nothing about the world beyond my living room. But they forgot that I spent 10 hours a day analyzing contracts, mitigating financial risks, and identifying corporate fraud. I knew how to write a contract that looked like a lifeline, but was actually a noose. The plan began to formulate with crystal clear precision. I would agree to fund Bradley's wedding and provide the proof of assets he needed for his in-laws, but in exchange, I would require them to put up every single piece of collateral they had left: the house in Oakbrook, the luxury cars, the remaining shares of Bradley's defunct businesses. I would cross-collateralize everything they owned against the $2 million advance. I would include an ironclad fraud clause stating that any misrepresentation of their financial status to me or to Chloe's family would result in the immediate forfeiture of all collateral to my sole possession. They would sign it. I knew they would sign it because they were arrogant and because they were running out of time. They would assume I was simply being thorough, and they would be too desperate to secure the funds to have a real lawyer review the fine print. They would sign away their entire lives, thinking they had outsmarted the quiet, obedient daughter. I typed furiously, the legal and financial terms flowing from my fingers with lethal accuracy. Every sentence was designed to lock them tighter into the trap. I would not just take their money. I would take their pride. I would take their country club status. I would take the very house where they had raised me to believe I was nothing. When the draft was finally complete, I sat back and looked at the screen. The trap was perfectly set. Now all I needed to do was perform my role. I needed to play the broken, grieving mother who just wanted her family's love. I needed to walk into the lion's den, smile at the brother who wanted to steal from a corpse, and nod at the mother who called my dying child a brat. I reached for my phone and opened the text thread with my mother. My fingers did not shake. My heart did not race. I was perfectly, profoundly calm. I typed a single message. Mom, you are right. I cannot do this alone. I need my family. I will help Bradley with the wedding and the prenup. Let us meet with a lawyer to make the transfer official. I hit send. Then I closed my laptop and walked down the hallway to Lily's room. I picked up her small yellow dress, holding it carefully in my hands. I am going to make them pay, my sweet girl, I whispered into the quiet night. I am going to make them pay for every single second they stole from you. The morning after I discovered the horrific recording on my daughter's iPad, the sun rose over Chicago with a bitter, pale light. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee that had gone cold hours ago. My mind was no longer clouded by the heavy, suffocating fog of grief. It was running with the terrifying precision of a machine. I knew exactly what I had to do. I had to give my parents exactly what they wanted, but wrapped in a package that would completely destroy them. I picked up my cell phone and stared at my mother's contact name. I took a deep breath. I needed to perform the role of a lifetime. I needed to become the weak, shattered, grieving mother they expected me to be. I closed my eyes, focused on the agonizing pain in my chest from losing Lily, and let the tears flow. I let my breathing become ragged and uneven. When I felt completely immersed in that raw vulnerability, I pressed call. My mother answered on the second ring. Her voice was guarded and sharp. "Hello, Sarah." "Mom," I gasped, letting out a heavy sob. "Mom, I am so sorry." The silence on the other end of the line shifted instantly. I could practically hear Susan standing up straighter, sensing blood in the water. "What is it, Sarah? What is wrong?" I pressed my hand over my mouth to muffle another fake sob. "You were right. You were completely right. I am sitting here in this empty house, and it is so quiet. Lily is gone. My husband is gone. I cannot do this completely alone anymore. Or, I need my family, I need you and Dad." "Oh, sweetheart." Susan's voice immediately softened into a sickeningly sweet, maternal coo. The sudden change in her tone made my stomach turn. "I knew you would see reason. Grief makes us say terrible things, Sarah. We know you did not mean to yell at us yesterday. We are your family. We are all you have left." I wiped a tear from my cheek, my expression turning to solid ice even as my voice continued to tremble. "I want to help Bradley," I whimpered. "I want to honor Lily's memory by keeping this family together. If transferring the trust fund to help with the wedding will do that, then I will do it. I will give him the $2 million. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. She had tried to mask her excitement, but her sheer greed gave her away. "That is a wonderful decision, Sarah. Your father will be so relieved. Bradley will be thrilled. This is exactly what Lily would have wanted. She would want her uncle to be happy." Hearing her use my dead child's name to justify stealing her money required every ounce of self-control I possessed not to scream. Instead, I forced my voice into a meek, submissive whisper. "But Mom, I cannot just wire $2 million. There are legal protocols. The trust is strictly monitored. We need to do this through a lawyer so the IRS does not penalize us. We need to make it official and legal." Of course, Susan agreed quickly. "Your father has a lawyer we can use." "No," I interrupted, injecting just enough panic into my voice to make it sound authentic. "No, I cannot use a stranger right now. My firm works with a highly respected estate attorney downtown. His name is William Sterling. Please let me use him. I trust him. It will make me feel so much safer." I held my breath, waiting for her response. If they insisted on using their own lawyer, the trap might fall apart. But Susan was too arrogant and too eager to get her hands on the cash. She assumed any lawyer I hired would be just as easily manipulated as I was. "That is perfectly fine, Sarah," Susan said, her voice dripping with triumphant satisfaction. "You set up the appointment with Mr. Sterling. We will be there." I hung up the phone, and the tears immediately stopped. The performance was over. I wiped my face, walked to my bedroom, and put on my sharpest business suit. It was time to build the snare. William Sterling was not just an estate attorney. He was a ruthless legal predator who specialized in high-asset trust protection and corporate litigation. I had met him 2 years ago during a massive audit for one of my wealthiest clients. I knew that if you wanted to build a contract with teeth, William was the man you called. I sat in his plush downtown Chicago office, overlooking the sprawling city skyline. I handed him the printed county records showing my father's secret $800,000 second mortgage. I handed him the business filings proving Bradley's companies were completely bankrupt. Then I explained the demand from Chloe's wealthy family for proof of assets before the prenuptial agreement could be signed. William looked over the documents, his sharp gray eyes calculating the angles. "They are trying to use your daughter's medical trust to fake their own liquidity," he said, tapping his expensive fountain pen against the mahogany desk. They are trying to commit financial fraud against the future in-laws, and they are using you as the bank." "Exactly," I said, "and I want to give them the money." William stopped tapping the pen. He looked at me with genuine surprise. "You want to give them the $2 million? "I want to give them an advance," I corrected smoothly. "I want you to draft an investment advance agreement. On paper, it needs to look like I am graciously releasing the trust funds to Bradley as a private family investment. But hidden in the fine print, I want a cross-collateralization clause. I want them to voluntarily put up every single asset they have left as collateral for this advance." William leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, appreciative smile spreading across his face. "You want to tie the debt to their physical property." "I want everything," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I want the Oakbrook house. I want my mother's luxury cars. I want Bradley's remaining shares in his defunct limited liability companies. I want the agreement to state that if the wedding does not occur, or if any financial misrepresentations have been made to any party involved, the entire $2 million advance is immediately recalled, and if they cannot pay it back upon recall, I gain the immediate, unhindered legal right to seize and liquidate their assets." "It is brilliant," William admitted, pulling a legal pad toward him. "But Sarah, you are dealing with people who are desperate. They might have a lawyer read this over." A first-year law student would spot a cross-collateralization trap this aggressive. "They will not read it," I said with absolute certainty. "They think I am a broken, weeping mess. They think I am terrified of losing them. Their arrogance will completely blind them to the details. They will only see the money. Make the language dense. Bury the forfeiture clauses under standard trust liability jargon. Make it look like bureaucratic red tape." William nodded his pen, moving swiftly across the paper. "I will have the draft ready by tomorrow morning." 2 days later, on a rainy Friday morning, the stage was perfectly set. I sat in William Sterling's expansive conference room, staring at the heavy oak doors. I was wearing an oversized gray sweater over my clothes, intentionally making myself look small, fragile, and completely exhausted. I kept my shoulders slumped and my gaze focused on the floor. At exactly 10 o'clock, the doors swung open. Richard, Susan, and Bradley walked in. They looked absolutely victorious. Richard wore a custom-tailored suit, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. Susan carried her designer handbag like a trophy, a smug, satisfied smile playing on her lips. Bradley looked like he had already spent the money checking his gold watch and glancing around the expensive law office with blatant approval. They did not greet me with a hug. They did not ask how I was holding up after burying Lily just a week prior. They simply took their seats at the massive conference table, their eyes locked on the thick stack of creamy legal paper sitting in front of William. "Thank you for coming," William said, his voice the perfect picture of professional neutrality. "Sarah has expressed her desire to support the family during this critical transition. Because the funds in question originate from a highly regulated medical trust, we must structure this transfer as an investment advance agreement to comply with federal tax guidelines." Richard waved his hand dismissively. "We understand how these things work, Mr. Sterling. Just point us to where we need to sign so my son can secure his wedding venue." William slid the documents across the table. "As you can see, this is a standard family trust release. The $2 million will be wired into Bradley's designated account within 48 hours of signing. However, because this is a massive transfer of wealth outside of the original trust parameters, the law requires a collateral guarantee. It is purely a formality to protect the trust from IRS audit penalties. A formality." My father repeated, grabbing the expensive pen William offered. "Exactly," William said smoothly. "You are simply listing your primary residence and vehicles as standard collateral. It shows the federal government that the trust is operating responsibly." Furthermore, Clause 18 details the standard misrepresentation guidelines. It basically says that everyone signing this document is acting in good faith and that the funds are being used for their stated purpose, which is Bradley's upcoming marriage. I watched them from beneath my lowered eyelashes, holding my breath. This was the moment. This was where any rational person would stop, ask questions, and demand to have their own counsel review the paperwork. A cross-collateral agreement meant they were risking the very roof over their heads. But my family was not rational. They were poisoned by greed and suffocated by their own desperation. Bradley needed that proof of funds today, or Chloe's father would cancel the wedding. Richard needed the wedding to happen to save himself from bankruptcy. They were backed into a corner of their own making, and the $2 million was the only way out. And then there was their perception of me. I let out a soft, pathetic-sounding sniffle and dabbed my eyes with a tissue. Susan glanced at me, her smile widening just a fraction. She looked at her daughter and saw a weak, pathetic victim who had finally submitted to the natural order of the family. She did not see an accountant who had just engineered their total financial ruin. "Where do we sign?" Susan asked eagerly, pulling the document toward her. William pointed to the last page. "I will need signatures from Richard, Susan, and Bradley. Initial the bottom of pages 4, 7, and 12 to acknowledge the collateral and forfeiture terms." I watched in silent awe as my father flipped to the back page. He did not read a single paragraph. He did not ask to review the forfeiture terms. He simply signed his name with a flourish. He passed the document to Susan, who signed it just as quickly. Finally, Bradley took the pen. He grinned at me, a truly chilling display of victory, before scribbling his signature on the dotted line. They had done it. They had voluntarily signed over the deed to their home, the titles to their cars, and their entire financial future to a grieving mother they had drastically underestimated. "Excellent," William said, taking the documents back and stamping them with his official notary seal. The trap snapped shut with a loud, heavy thud that only William and I could hear. "The funds will be released by Monday morning. I will provide you all with certified copies of the agreement for your records." Richard stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a satisfied sigh. "Well, Sarah," he said, looking down at me, "you finally did the right thing for your family. We will see you at the rehearsal dinner next week. Make sure you dress appropriately. Chloe's family has very high standards." "I will be there," I whispered, keeping my eyes glued to the table. I would not miss it for the world. They walked out of the conference room without a backward glance, leaving me alone with William. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them. I slowly sat up straight, rolling my shoulders back and letting out a long, steady breath. William gathered the signed documents, tapping them against the mahogany table to align the edges. He looked at me, his gray eyes wide with professional admiration. "I have been practicing law for 30 years, Sarah. I have never seen people sign away their entire lives that quickly without asking a single question." "Greed is a powerful anesthetic," I said quietly. It completely numbed their common sense. William slid the original contract into a secure leather folder. "The cross-collateralization is ironclad. The fraud clause is absolute. If Bradley's wedding falls through, or if Chloe's father discovers Bradley lied about his net worth, you legally own everything your parents have left." I stood up, grabbing my purse. My heart was no longer aching with grief. It was beating with a steady, relentless rhythm of pure vindication. They thought they had won. They thought they had secured their future by stealing from my dead child. They had no idea that they had just handed me the match and the gasoline to burn their entire fake upper-class empire to ash. I walked out of the law office and stepped into the bustling Chicago street. The rain had finally stopped. The sun was breaking through the gray clouds, casting a brilliant light over the city. I still had to endure a week of their gloating. I still had to endure the wedding preparations and the sickening fake smiles. But I could do it. I could endure anything because I held the ultimate winning hand. The illusion of my submission was complete, and the countdown to their absolute destruction had officially begun. The $2 million cleared the trust account on Monday morning. I sat at my small kitchen table, watching the digital numbers on my banking portal drop to zero. The money that was supposed to cover my little girl's medical care was gone, transferred directly into the joint account my parents shared with Bradley. The trap was officially funded, and almost immediately, the illusion of their compassion vanished. With the money secured and their financial terror temporarily relieved, Richard and Susan reverted instantly to their true nature. The brief, sickening performance of parental concern they had put on in William Sterling's law office evaporated like mist. I was no longer a grieving mother who needed their support. I was once again the family workhorse. It was exactly 1 week before the wedding. My daughter had been buried less than 14 days ago, but in my parents' minds, the mourning period had officially expired. They had a country club spectacle to execute. That same Monday afternoon, my phone rang. It was Susan. She did not ask how I was sleeping or if I was eating. She barked a list of demands as if I were a hired personal assistant who had simply shown up late for a shift. "Sarah," she said, her voice clipped and urgent. The custom silk table runners arrived at the boutique downtown, but the courier canceled. "I need you to drive into the city, pick them up, and bring them directly to the country club for the table mock-ups. Also, Bradley forgot to pick up the groomsmen gifts from the engraver. You need to handle that too. Do not dawdle. We are on a very strict timeline." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her that my chest physically ached with every breath I took because the silence in my house without Lily was deafening. But I remembered the signed cross-collateral agreement sitting securely in my lawyer's vault. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and forced my voice into a flat, obedient tone. "I will go get them, Mom." For the next 5 days, I was subjected to the most grueling, humiliating servitude of my entire life. I became their unpaid delivery driver, their event coordinator, and their emotional punching bag. I drove my 10-year-old car back and forth across the wealthy Chicago suburbs, fetching crystal centerpieces, coordinating with nervous caterers, and organizing seating charts for people who had not even bothered to send a sympathy card when my child died. I carried heavy boxes of imported champagne flutes through the back service entrances of the Oak Brook Country Club, sweating in my cheap black clothes, while the club staff looked at me with pity. On Wednesday afternoon, the humiliation reached a new level. Susan had demanded I meet her at their prestigious Episcopal church to assist with the floral walkthrough. The sanctuary was massive, with soaring stained glass windows and polished oak pews. It was a place designed to project wealth and moral superiority. When I walked through the heavy wooden doors carrying 2 massive binders of floral invoices, I saw my mother standing near the altar. She was surrounded by 3 of her wealthiest socialite friends from the congregation. Susan was wearing a brand new designer pantsuit. The tag was still tucked inside the collar, but I knew instantly it cost more than my monthly rent. She was pointing at the altar, directing the florist to add more cascading white orchids. I walked quietly down the center aisle, clutching the heavy binders to my chest. My eyes felt burning and dry. I had spent the entire morning staring at a photo of Lily, trying to remember the exact sound of her laugh. As I approached the group, I heard the hushed, conspiratorial tone of my mother's voice. She was not talking about the flowers. She was talking about me. "It has been a difficult time," one of the women, a wealthy real estate broker named Martha, was saying. "We were so worried about poor Sarah after the little girl passed. It is such a blessing that you and Richard stepped in to save her from completely falling apart." Susan sighed deeply, pressing a manicured hand to her chest in a flawless display of maternal martyrdom. "It is the burden of being a parent, Martha. You never stop caring for them. Sarah has always been so lost, so directionless, but having this wedding to focus on having a purpose has been a godsend for her. She is finally getting her life back on track, thanks to our family's guidance. We are just glad we can provide a strong foundation for her when she has absolutely nothing else." I stopped dead in my tracks a few feet behind them. The sheer staggering hypocrisy of her words hit me like a physical blow. She was standing in a house of worship, taking credit for saving my soul, while actively spending the money she had extorted from my dead daughter's medical trust. She was using my grief as a prop to elevate her own social standing among her country club friends. She wanted them to see her as the benevolent, tragic matriarch, holding her broken family together with grace and deep pockets. My hands gripped the edges of the floral binders so tightly my knuckles turned white. A violent surge of adrenaline rushed through my veins. I wanted to drop the binders right there on the polished stone floor. I wanted to scream the truth until the stained glass windows rattled. I wanted to ask Martha if she knew that Susan's designer suit was paid for by a dead 7-year-old. But the cold, calculating mind of the accountant took over. I took a deep breath, forcing my heart rate to slow. I smoothed my expression into a blank mask of quiet subservience. I stepped forward and politely handed Susan the invoices. She barely looked at me, simply snatching the binders and waving her hand to dismiss me back to the car. I walked back down the aisle, perfectly playing the part of the broken, grateful daughter. Let her have her audience, I thought. Let her build her pedestal as high as possible. The fall would break every bone in her ego. If my mother's arrogance was suffocating, Chloe's cruelty was sharp and direct. Bradley's fiancée was 29 years old, a woman born into generational wealth who viewed anyone with less money as a personal insult. She had never liked me. She thought my modest life as a freelance accountant was embarrassing, but during that final week before the wedding, her disdain mutated into open psychological warfare. On Thursday evening, I was summoned to the country club for a final rehearsal of the bridal party entrances. I arrived straight from the cemetery where I had gone to place fresh flowers on Lily's grave. I was exhausted, wearing a simple gray sweater and worn-out jeans. When I walked into the grand ballroom, Chloe was standing in the center of the room, surrounded by her bridesmaids, who all looked like they had just stepped off a runway. Chloe took one look at me and let out a loud theatrical sigh. "Sarah," she snapped, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "Are you seriously wearing that to the rehearsal dinner tomorrow night?" Because my parents have hired a professional photography team, and I absolutely cannot have you ruining the aesthetic of the family portraits looking like a charity case. I stood frozen under the harsh glare of the ballroom lights. "I have a dress for tomorrow," I said quietly. "It better be a nice one," Chloe shot back. "And another thing. When you drive to the venue tomorrow, do not park that tragic little sedan of yours anywhere near the front valet. My father's business partners are bringing their clients, and I do not want your 10-year-old junk pile ruining the first impression of the event. Park in the employee lot in the back and walk around." She crossed her arms, and as she did, the ballroom lights caught the massive diamond ring on her left hand. It was a new ring. Bradley had proposed with a modest 2-carat stone a year ago, but the rock sitting on her finger now was easily 5 carats, flawless and blindingly bright. My eyes locked onto that diamond. The analytical machinery in my brain engaged, instantly crunching the numbers. A stone that size and clarity cost roughly $150,000. Bradley's businesses were bankrupt. Richard's house was mortgaged to the hilt. There was only one place that money could have come from. Bradley had taken the advance from my daughter's medical trust and used it to upgrade his fiancée's engagement ring. He had taken the money meant to ease a dying child's pain and turned it into a shiny rock to impress a spoiled heiress. I felt a sickening lurch in my stomach, but I forced my eyes away from the ring and nodded at Chloe. "I will park in the back," I said softly. "Good," she replied, turning her back to me completely. I walked out of the ballroom, my mind working furiously. The upgraded diamond ring was the confirmation I needed. They were not just using the $2 million to show proof of assets to Chloe's father. They were actively spending it. They were burning through the trust fund with reckless abandon, assuming that I would never ask for an accounting of the funds. That night, I drove to my parents' house under the pretense of dropping off the finalized seating charts. Susan and Richard were out at a wine tasting event with Chloe's parents. The house was empty. I let myself in with my old key and walked directly into my father's home office. I was not breaking the law. I was simply doing my due diligence as the chief investor in their lives. The desk was littered with fresh invoices and receipts. My father had never been careful with his paperwork. I pulled out my phone and began snapping high-resolution photos of every document I could find. There was a receipt from a luxury jeweler in downtown Chicago for $160,000. There was an invoice from a luxury travel agency detailing a 3-week honeymoon to the Maldives for Bradley and Chloe, complete with first-class flights and overwater villas paid in full. There were receipts for Susan's new designer wardrobe and Richard's custom-tailored Italian suits. In less than 4 days, they had blown through nearly $300,000 of the trust advance. Every photograph I took was another nail in their financial coffin. The investment advance agreement they had signed with William Sterling explicitly stated that the funds were provided strictly as a temporary proof of liquidity, and that any unauthorized dissipation of the principal amount constituted financial fraud. By spending the money, they had legally triggered the default clause. The trap was no longer just set. It had snapped shut on their ankles, and they were still happily dancing around, unaware they were bleeding to death. I placed the papers back exactly as I had found them. I walked out of the house, leaving the seating charts on the kitchen island. I drove back to my quiet, empty house. I did not cry that night. I sat at my computer organizing the photos into a secure digital file. I sent the entire encrypted folder to William Sterling with a single sentence. The breach is confirmed. Prepare the foreclosure notices. Friday night arrived with a chilling, quiet intensity. The evening of the rehearsal dinner at the Oak Brook Country Club was the undisputed social event of the season for my parents. This was their moment of absolute triumph. This was the night they officially merged their heavily mortgaged existence with the generational wealth of Chloe's family. I pulled my 10-year-old sedan into the employee parking lot at the back of the club, exactly as Chloe had commanded. I turned off the engine and sat in the dark for a long moment. I was wearing a simple tailored black dress. It was the exact same dress I had worn to my daughter's funeral. I thought it was a fitting choice for a night that would bring so much death to my family's illusions. I walked around the perimeter of the sprawling clubhouse, the gravel crunching softly beneath my low heels. The main entrance was a chaotic symphony of luxury. Valets were rushing to open the doors of imported sports cars and black town cars. Wealthy men in dark suits and women in glittering evening gowns filed into the grand lobby. I slipped through the side doors entirely unnoticed and made my way toward the private banquet hall. The room was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over tables draped in heavy white linen. Enormous centerpieces of white roses and hydrangeas, the very flowers I had been forced to coordinate, dominated the room. A jazz quartet played softly in the corner, providing an elegant backdrop to the loud, confident chatter of Chicago's elite. I stood near the back wall, watching the room fill. There were over 150 guests. Chloe's powerful father, an imposing man named Arthur, who radiated authority, was holding court near the private bar, laughing loudly with his wealthy business partners. Members of my parents' church congregation mingled with the country club regulars, nodding and smiling in a sea of performative grace. And then there were my parents. Richard and Susan were practically glowing. They moved through the crowd with an arrogant swagger, accepting congratulations and shaking hands. Richard slapped Bradley on the back, pointing out important guests. Susan clutched her new designer clutch bag to her chest, laughing her shrill practiced laugh, throwing her head back to show off her new diamond necklace. They looked like royalty, who had just secured their kingdom. They looked around the room, feeling untouchable. They had successfully navigated their secret bankruptcy. They had secured the wealthy daughter-in-law. They had outsmarted their grieving daughter and stolen $2 million without breaking a sweat. They believed that by tomorrow afternoon, they would be permanently elevated into the upper echelons of society. I stood in the shadows, my hands resting quietly at my sides. My purse hung over my shoulder, heavy with the weight of my phone and the certified copies of the cross-collateralization agreements William Sterling had given me. I looked at the crowd. I looked at my brother holding his wealthy fiancé's hand. I looked at the parents who had abandoned me at a cemetery in the rain. The wait was over. The humiliation, the servitude, the endless biting of my tongue had all led to this precise second in time. The trap was fully primed. The audience was seated. The doors were closed. I watched my father confidently stride toward the main podium at the front of the room, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute to command the attention of the elite crowd. The room began to quiet down, the jazz quartet fading into silence. I took a deep breath, letting the cold, analytical rage fill my lungs. It was time to drop the hammer. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom at the Oak Brook Country Club stood open before me. I took one final breath of the cool evening air before crossing the threshold into a world built entirely on lies. The sheer scale of the opulence inside was physically jarring. I had spent the past 3 years in sterile hospital rooms, surrounded by the constant rhythmic beeping of medical monitors and the sharp smell of antiseptic. Now I was stepping into a cavernous space, bathed in the warm golden glow of massive crystal chandeliers. Every detail of the room had been designed to project wealth and establish social dominance. The tables were draped in thick ivory silk. In the center of each table sat the towering arrangements of imported white orchids and hydrangeas that I had been forced to carry through the service entrance just days prior. The sheer volume of the flowers was staggering. They cascaded down tall glass vases like white waterfalls, completely obscuring the faces of the guests seated across from one another. I knew the exact dollar amount printed on the floral invoices. I knew that the money used to purchase these dying plants had been siphoned directly from the medical trust fund, meant to ease my 7-year-old daughter's suffering. I stood near the back wall, near a towering pillar wrapped in white tulle, and simply watched the room fill with Chicago's elite. There were over 150 people in attendance. The men wore custom-tailored dark suits, and the women were draped in expensive designer evening gowns. Waiters in pristine white jackets glided silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays lined with crystal flutes of imported champagne. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the loud, confident chatter of people who believed they were untouchable. My eyes scanned the crowd and found my brother Bradley standing near the private bar. He was holding court with a group of his former fraternity brothers, laughing loudly with a glass of scotch in his hand. Beside him stood his fiancée, Chloe. She was wearing a sleek, pearl-colored dress that clung to her perfectly manicured frame. As she reached up to brush a strand of hair behind her ear, the ballroom lights caught the massive 5-carat diamond ring on her left hand. The stone flashed with a blinding, brilliant light. I stared at that diamond and felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. That ring was bought with the blood money they had stolen from Lily. Chloe was flashing it around the room, completely unaware that it represented the ultimate betrayal of a dying child. Chloe's parents were standing just a few feet away, engaging in polite conversation with the head pastor of my parents' church. Her father, Arthur, was an imposing man with broad shoulders and a stern, judging face. He was a highly successful corporate lawyer who radiated authority and expected absolute perfection from everyone around him. He had demanded proof of a $2 million net worth before allowing this wedding to proceed. He believed he was marrying his daughter into a family of equal financial and social standing. He had no idea he was shaking hands with a family drowning in secret second mortgages and toxic debt. And then I saw my parents. Richard and Susan were moving through the center of the ballroom, practically glowing with arrogant triumph. Susan was wearing a brand new sapphire blue evening gown. A thick diamond tennis necklace rested against her collarbone. She was clutching the arm of a wealthy real estate developer, throwing her head back in a shrill, practiced laugh. Richard walked beside her, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride, firmly shaking hands and clapping other men on the shoulder. They looked victorious. They had successfully masked their total financial ruin. They had secured a wealthy daughter-in-law to elevate their social status. They had bullied and manipulated their grieving daughter into signing over a $2 million trust fund. In their minds, the war was over, and they had won everything. They truly believed that by tomorrow afternoon, they would be permanently cemented into the upper echelons of society. I remained in the shadows watching them perform. I was wearing a simple tailored black dress with long sleeves and a high neckline. It was the exact same dress I had worn to bury my daughter less than 2 weeks ago. I had not bought a new outfit for this occasion. I did not want to blend in with the sea of brightly colored designer gowns. I wanted to stand out as a quiet, dark reminder of the reality they were trying so desperately to ignore. I clutched my small black purse. Inside it, resting heavily against my side, was my cell phone. The event coordinator stepped to the center of the room and gently tapped a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice echoing softly over the speakers, "please find your seats. Dinner is about to be served." "Dinner is..." The crowd slowly migrated toward the tables. I walked quietly to my assigned seat at a table near the back corner, far away from the head table where my parents, Bradley, and Chloe's family were seated. I was placed next to a few distant cousins and some older members of my parents' church congregation. They offered me polite, sympathetic smiles and murmured hollow condolences about Lily. I nodded, acknowledging their words without actually hearing them. My entire focus was locked on the head table at the front of the room. The dinner service began. A small army of waiters descended upon the tables, delivering plates of seared filet mignon, truffle mashed potatoes, and roasted asparagus. The smell of the rich, heavy food turned my stomach. I thought about the hospital cafeteria food I had survived on for 3 years. I thought about the feeding tube they had inserted into Lily during her final weeks. I looked down at the expensive slab of meat on my porcelain plate and felt a wave of absolute nausea. I did not touch a single bite. For over an hour, I sat in silence, listening to the endless, superficial chatter around me. The wealthy guests discussed their upcoming winter vacations, their golf handicaps, and the recent fluctuations in the stock market. Nobody mentioned my daughter. Nobody mentioned the fact that a child had just died. It was as if Lily had been completely erased from existence, replaced by the overwhelming importance of this country club spectacle. As the waiters began clearing the dinner plates to make way for dessert, the lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly. A single spotlight illuminated a small wooden podium positioned near the head table. The jazz quartet stopped playing. The low hum of conversation faded into an expectant silence. My father stood up from his seat at the center of the head table. He buttoned his custom-tailored suit jacket with a slow, deliberate motion, projecting an aura of dignified authority. He picked up his crystal champagne flute and walked towards the podium. Susan watched him go, her face glowing with intense pride. She leaned over and whispered something to Chloe's mother, patting her hand affectionately. Richard stepped up to the microphone and tapped his silver spoon against his glass. The sharp, clear, ringing sound cut through the quiet room, demanding total attention. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his deep voice rolling over the high-quality sound system. "I want to thank you all for joining us tonight in this beautiful venue to celebrate the upcoming union of two wonderful families. Looking out at all of you, my friends, my colleagues, my brothers and sisters in faith, I am overwhelmed with a profound sense of gratitude." A soft murmur of approval rippled through the audience. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, my eyes locked entirely on my father's face. "Family is the absolute cornerstone of a successful life," Richard continued, gripping the edges of the podium. "Family requires dedication. It requires loyalty. Above all else, true family requires sacrifice. We must always be willing to put the needs of the family unit above our own individual desires. We must stand together, completely united, to build a legacy that will last for generations." I felt my jaw clench so tightly. My teeth ached. He was standing in front of 150 people, preaching about sacrifice. This was a man who had secretly mortgaged his home to cover his golden son's bankruptcies. This was a man who had demanded his grieving daughter hand over her dead child's medical trust fund to pay for the very party we were attending. The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy was staggering. "Tonight we are not just celebrating a wedding," my father said, gesturing warmly toward Bradley and Chloe. "We are celebrating the future. We are celebrating my son Bradley, a man who has worked tirelessly to build a successful career and establish himself as a pillar of this community. He has brought immense pride to the Myers family name. And tomorrow, he will marry Chloe, a brilliant, beautiful woman who we are so incredibly thrilled to welcome into our lives. Arthur and Helen." He nodded respectfully to Chloe's parents. "You have raised an extraordinary daughter, and we are honored to join our families together." Arthur nodded back, his stern face relaxing into a satisfied smile. They were buying the performance completely. They truly believed they were aligning themselves with a family of equal moral and financial standing. "But as we look toward this bright future," Richard said, his voice suddenly dropping an octave, taking on a somber theatrical tone, "we must also remember those who cannot be here with us tonight. As many of you know, our family recently suffered a terrible, tragic loss." My heart stopped beating. The air in my lungs turned to ice. He was going to use her. He was going to use my daughter as a prop in his disgusting speech. "My beautiful granddaughter Lily was taken from us far too soon," my father said, bowing his head slightly for dramatic effect. "Her passing has left a hole in our hearts that can never truly be filled." Susan and I were so devastated by the grief, so physically destroyed by the sorrow, that we could barely function. But we knew that Lily would not want us to dwell in the darkness. I gripped the edge of the table. My fingernails dug into the thick white linen. He had not shed a single tear for her. He had not attended her funeral. He had called her a brat while she was taking her final breaths. "Lily was a bright, shining light," my father continued, his voice thick with fake emotion. And I know that right now, she is looking down from heaven, smiling at her Uncle Bradley. She is our little guardian angel, watching over this marriage, blessing this union. She would want us to celebrate tonight. She would want us to be happy, so please raise your glasses. The entire ballroom raised their crystal flutes. To Bradley and Chloe, my father proclaimed. To a future built on strong foundations, deep family loyalty, and enduring love. May your lives be as rich and full as the legacy we share. Here the crowd echoed. Glasses clinked together in a wave of polite applause. Richard smiled humbly, accepting the quiet cheers as he stepped down from the podium and returned to his seat. Susan reached out and squeezed his hand, beaming at him. It was the perfect speech. It had successfully painted them as wealthy, resilient, and deeply moral people who were bravely pushing through a family tragedy to celebrate their golden son. The applause began to die down. The jazz quartet prepared to start playing again. I pushed my chair back from the table. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the marble floor. Several people sitting near me turned to look, their expressions registering mild surprise as I stood up. I smoothed the front of my black funeral dress. I picked up my small black purse, holding it tightly in my right hand. I did not rush. I walked with a slow, deliberate, measured pace, navigating between the tables covered in white silk and dying orchids. Every step I took felt heavy and intentional. As I moved closer to the front of the room, more and more heads began to turn. The remaining chatter in the ballroom faded into a tense, curious silence. I walked past the wealthy real estate brokers. I walked past the church elders. I walked past Chloe's parents, who watched me approach with slightly furrowed brows. I stopped at the head table. Bradley was sitting with his arm draped over Chloe's chair, a smug, arrogant grin plastered across his face. Susan looked at me, her blue eyes sparkling with absolute victorious delight. Richard leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms comfortably. They thought they knew exactly what was happening. We had signed the investment advance agreement just days ago. The $2 million had been officially cleared and transferred. In their arrogant, delusional minds, they believed that my walk to the podium meant only one thing. They fully assumed that the broken, submissive daughter was coming forward to publicly announce the massive financial gift. They thought I was going to stand in front of Chicago's elite and declare that I was using Lily's trust to secure Bradley's future, forever cementing the Myers family status and proving their immense wealth to Chloe's father. Susan actually leaned forward and gave me an encouraging nod, pointing discreetly toward the microphone. She wanted me to give them the ultimate public relations victory. I stepped up to the small wooden podium. The microphone was still angled perfectly for my father's height. I reached out and pulled the heavy metal stand down, adjusting it to my level. The sharp screech of the microphone picking up the movement echoed loudly through the silent ballroom, making a few people in the front row flinch. I looked out over the crowd of 150 faces. They were all staring at me, waiting for the grieving mother to validate the beautiful family narrative my father had just woven. I looked down at my parents. They were smiling smugly, practically radiating anticipation. I opened my small black purse and reached inside. My fingers closed around the cold, familiar shape of my cell phone. I pulled it out and set it gently on the wooden surface of the podium. Next to the microphone base rested the auxiliary audio cable used by the event staff to play background music between the jazz sets. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice completely flat, devoid of any emotion. It was not shaking. It was not weak. It was as cold and sharp as the winter wind. My father just spoke very eloquently about family values. He spoke about loyalty. He spoke about the immense sacrifices we make to build a strong foundation for the future. Susan beamed, nodding her head in vigorous agreement. He also spoke about my daughter Lily. I continued, my voice dropping slightly, commanding the absolute silence of the enormous room. He told you that she is a guardian angel looking down on this wedding. He told you that she would want us to celebrate tonight. I picked up the auxiliary cord. The heavy metal jack gleamed under the spotlight. I plugged it directly into the bottom of my cell phone. A soft electronic hum vibrated through the massive speakers positioned in all four corners of the ballroom, indicating the connection was live. "Before we drink to the groom," I said, looking directly into my father's eyes, "I have a very special message from my daughter." I tapped the screen of my phone. The digital play button turned into a pause symbol. For a fraction of a second, there was nothing but the soft hum of the sound system. Then my mother's voice filled the cavernous ballroom. It was loud and perfectly clear, ringing out from the high-end speakers positioned in every corner of the room. The doctor told me outside that there is nothing more they can do. He says the brat only has a few hours left at most. The sheer cruelty of those words, amplified to that volume, hit the crowd like a physical shockwave. People froze in their seats. I kept my eyes locked on my father. His smug expression evaporated instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The audio continued playing, echoing off the crystal chandeliers and the polished marble floors. Bradley's recorded voice asked about the non-refundable deposits. Then came my father's booming voice over the speakers. It was the very same voice that had just preached to this room about family values and guardian angels. Just moments ago. "Once she dies, that $2 million is ours. Sarah is completely falling apart. She is barely sleeping and she can hardly string 2 sentences together. She is so weak right now, getting her to sign the power of attorney over the trust fund will be a breeze." I watched my mother. Susan's face completely drained of blood, turning a sickly shade of chalk white. She reached out and gripped the edge of the head table so tightly, the knuckles on her hands turned bone white. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, looking at the horrified faces of her wealthy friends. The recording played the final, devastating lines. The entire room listened to my mother complaining about how much money had been wasted on hospital bills for my dying 7-year-old child. They listened to her state that the money should have been theirs from the beginning. They heard her explicitly tell my father that they needed to hurry back into the waiting room and pretend to be crying to keep up appearances. The recording ended. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom were shut tight, trapping the horrific truth inside with 150 guests. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not just a quiet room. It was the total, suffocating silence of high society elites, church elders, and wealthy investors, realizing they were sitting in the presence of actual monsters. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The clinking of silverware had stopped completely. The waiters stood frozen, holding trays of expensive wine. Then Chloe, the beautiful, wealthy bride, to be dropped her crystal champagne flute. The glass hit the polished marble floor and shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces. The sharp breaking sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent ballroom. Chloe was staring at Bradley with wide, horrified eyes, taking a slow step away from him as if he were suddenly carrying a contagious disease. She looked at her own engagement ring, and a look of pure physical revulsion washed over her features. At the table nearby, Chloe's parents stood up simultaneously. Arthur, the formidable corporate lawyer, looked as though he had been physically struck. His face, which just moments ago had been relaxed with a satisfied smile, was now a mask of pure, appalled disgust. He looked at my father and then at Bradley. His jaw clenched so tightly a massive vein throbbed in his neck. He fiercely protected his family's reputation, and he had just realized he was about to merge his bloodline with predators who plotted to steal from a dying child. Richard finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He realized his entire world, his pristine reputation, his social standing, and his financial salvation was going up in flames right in front of him. "Turn that off," he roared, his voice cracking with sheer panic. He scrambled out of his chair, knocking it backward onto the floor, and lunged toward the podium. "Give me that phone, Sarah." He did not make it past the head table. Before I could even brace myself, 2 massive men in dark suits stepped out from the shadows near the back wall and moved with incredible speed. I had hired private security specifically for this event, knowing my father's violent temper when backed into a corner. They intercepted Richard, grabbing him by the shoulders and physically shoving him back toward the dining chairs. "Do not take another step toward her," one of the guards ordered, his voice low and incredibly dangerous. Richard struggled against their grip, his face turning a mottled shade of red. "Let me go. That is my daughter. She is crazy. The audio is fake. It is an edited recording. She is trying to ruin us out of spite." I was shouting wildly, looking desperately at the crowd, begging them to believe his pathetic lies. But nobody was buying it. The audio was undeniably authentic. The tone, the cadence, the sheer casual cruelty of their voices was impossible to replicate. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood tall at the podium, looking down at the man who had ordered me to give up my dead child's money. "It is not fake, Richard," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the microphone. "Everyone in this room just heard exactly who you and Susan truly are. You did not skip Lily's funeral because you were heartbroken. You skipped it because you were too busy planning a country club party with the money you planned to extort from her tragic death." Susan let out a strangled wailing sound, pressing her hands to her face. She looked toward her wealthy church friends, the women she had gossiped with just 2 days ago at the sanctuary. She was seeking a lifeline, seeking someone to defend her honor. But the women were staring back at her with expressions of absolute revulsion. Martha, the wealthy real estate broker, actually turned her chair to face away from my mother. People were already whispering, shielding their mouths, pulling their designer coats tightly around their shoulders as if my parents were infectious. Arthur stepped forward, his commanding presence cutting through the heavy tension of the ballroom. "Bradley," he barked, his voice laced with pure venom. "What the hell is this? What trust fund is she talking about? You told me you built your wealth through your successful real estate ventures. You showed me financial projections based on your own capital." I turned my attention entirely to Chloe's father. I reached into my small black purse and pulled out the thick, folded envelope containing the certified legal documents William Sterling had prepared. I held the envelope up high for the entire room to see. "Bradley did not build anything," I announced, my voice steady and completely devoid of pity. "Bradley is a massive fraud. His businesses are entirely bankrupt, and he is heavily in debt to multiple private creditors. The $2 million he claimed as his personal net worth was the medical trust fund left to my 7-year-old daughter who died of cancer less than 2 weeks ago." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. I heard several older women in the back rows murmur in absolute horror. The shock in the room was palpable. "My parents forced me into signing over that money to save this very wedding," I continued, looking directly at Arthur, maintaining unblinking eye contact. "Richard took out a massive secret second mortgage on his house just to bail out Bradley's failed business ventures. They are drowning in toxic debt, Arthur. They are secretly bankrupt. They needed my dead child's money to prove to you that Bradley was financially stable, so you would sign the prenuptial agreement and allow him to marry Chloe. This entire wedding, this massive country club event, is nothing but a desperate financial scam to secure your family's money." Bradley's face went completely pale. He opened his mouth to speak, to formulate some kind of lie to save himself, but no sound came out. He looked at Chloe, reaching a shaking hand out toward her. "Chloe, please do not listen to her. She is insane. My businesses are fine. We just had a temporary cash flow issue." I opened the envelope and pulled out the investment advance agreement. "If your businesses are fine, Bradley, then why did you, your father, and your mother all willingly sign a collateralization agreement with me? Just 4 days ago," I asked into the microphone. I raised the official stamped paper high into the air. In this legally binding document, they put up their house, their luxury cars, and every last remaining share of Bradley's companies as collateral in exchange for a cash advance on the trust fund. They signed away everything they own because they were completely out of time and completely out of money. Arthur's eyes locked onto the legal document in my hand. Being a highly seasoned corporate lawyer, he understood exactly what cross-collateralization meant. He understood the absolute rock-bottom desperation required for a family to sign away their primary residence for a short-term cash injection. He saw the official notary stamp from a prestigious downtown law firm, and he knew instantly that I was telling the absolute truth. "And there is a strict fraud clause in this contract," I added, letting a small cold smile touch my lips for the first time all evening. "It clearly states that any financial misrepresentation to me or to any other party automatically triggers a default. By lying to Chloe's family about your net worth, you have defaulted on the agreement. The $2 million has already been legally recalled and completely frozen by my attorneys. You have absolutely nothing left." The realization hit my family like a swinging wrecking ball. The money was gone. The secret was out in the open. The trap had snapped entirely shut, and there was no legal or social escape. Arthur did not need to hear another word. He turned to Bradley, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. "You sickening, pathetic little con artist." Arthur spat, his voice ringing clearly across the quiet room. "You actually thought you could trick my daughter into marrying a bankrupt failure who preys on a grieving mother. You are lower than dirt. You will never come near my family again." Arthur did not wait for a response. He turned to his daughter, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "Chloe, we are leaving right now. Get your coat." Chloe did not hesitate. She looked at Bradley with tears of intense humiliation and rage streaming down her beautifully contoured face. She reached up, grabbed the massive 5-carat diamond ring off her finger, and threw it directly at Bradley's chest with all her might. The heavy diamond bounced off his tailored jacket and clattered loudly onto the marble floor, rolling away under a table. "Do not ever contact me again," she said, her voice shaking with disgust. She turned and practically ran toward the exit, following her parents out the heavy oak doors. The immediate cancellation of the wedding and the departure of the wealthy in-laws was the final fatal strike. Susan could not handle the instantaneous public destruction of her carefully crafted social empire. The reality that she was bankrupt, exposed as a monster, and abandoned by her high society peers broke her completely. She let out a loud, hysterical scream and collapsed onto the ballroom floor. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing wildly, rocking back and forth in her expensive sapphire gown. She looked utterly pathetic, a broken shell of a woman mourning her country club membership and her social status, rather than the beautiful granddaughter she had lost. Richard was still being held back by the security guards, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically around the room. He was watching his entire life evaporate into thin air. He had lost the wealthy connections. He had lost the $2 million. And because of the contract he had so arrogantly signed, without reading, he was about to lose the very roof over his head. He was a ruined man. The rest of the guests did not linger to watch the fallout. The elite socialites, the wealthy real estate developers, the judgmental church elders, they all began moving toward the exits en masse. It was a rapid, silent exodus. Nobody stopped to comfort Susan as she wailed on the floor. Nobody offered Richard a sympathetic pat on the shoulder. They grabbed their expensive coats and purses, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Myers family scandal. They looked at my parents with absolute revulsion, treating them exactly like the social pariahs they had become. I stood at the podium and watched the grand ballroom empty out. The beautiful white floral arrangements, the crystal glasses, the lavish decorations, they all looked like cheap props in a tragic comedy that had finally reached its ultimate end. The room that was supposed to be the site of their greatest victory had become the graveyard of their arrogance. I unplugged my phone from the sound system, winding the cord neatly. I placed the phone back into my purse. I folded the legal documents, ensuring the creases were sharp, and tucked them away safely next to my keys. I looked down at my father one last time. He had stopped struggling against the guards. He was staring at me, his face a hollow portrait of absolute devastating defeat. "I told you I would not fund a country club party with my daughter's suffering," I said, my voice quiet but perfectly clear in the empty room. "I hope the rehearsal dinner was worth it, Richard." I turned my back on them. I walked away from the podium, my heels clicking a steady, confident rhythm on the marble floor. I did not look back at my mother crying hysterically on the ground. I did not look back at my brother standing alone and bankrupt in the ruins of his fake life. I walked out the side doors into the cool, damp Chicago night, breathing in the fresh air. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried for weeks was finally gone. I walked to my 10-year-old car in the employee parking lot, exactly where they had told me to park. But as I started the engine and drove away from the glowing lights of the country club, I was not the victim anymore. I had delivered absolute justice for my daughter, and I was finally entirely free. The days immediately following the disastrous rehearsal dinner brought a profound and beautiful silence to my home. For the first time since my daughter passed away, I woke up and listened to the morning rain tapping against my bedroom window without feeling a suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. I made my black coffee. I sat at my kitchen table. I breathed. While I was finally finding a tiny sliver of peace, The upper-class empire my parents had ruthlessly protected was burning to the ground. The fallout was swift and absolute. It began with Bradley. The wedding had been canceled less than 24 hours before the grand ceremony was scheduled to begin. In the world of high-end luxury events, a cancellation that late is financially catastrophic. The grand ballroom at the Oak Brook Country Club had already been set up. The custom menu of filet mignon and imported truffles had already been prepped by the executive chefs for 300 guests. The 12-piece live orchestra, the massive towering arrangements of white orchids, the premium open bar, everything had been mobilized and staged. When Chloe's father, Arthur, walked out of the rehearsal dinner, he made sure his high-powered lawyers immediately severed his family from every single vendor contract. He legally and ruthlessly left Bradley holding the bag for everything. Because Bradley had eagerly signed the final venue agreements in his desperate attempt to look like a wealthy, independent entrepreneur, he was now personally liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars in non-refundable event debts. The caterers and the florists did not care about broken hearts or canceled vows. They wanted their money. But Bradley had absolutely no money. The trust advance he had relied on was legally frozen, and his own business accounts were completely dead. The invoices began piling up immediately, compounding with late fees and breach of contract penalties. Arthur did not just stop at canceling the wedding and leaving Bradley with a mountain of debt. A man like Arthur, a powerful corporate attorney with deep roots in Chicago elite circles, does not take kindly to being conned. He decided to make a permanent example of my brother. Arthur did not have to file public lawsuits to destroy Bradley. He only had to make a few quiet phone calls to his extensive network of partners, investors, and country club associates. He simply told them the truth. He told them Bradley Myers was a desperate fraud who tried to use his dying niece to fake a massive net worth. In the wealthy elite circles of Chicago, reputation is the only currency that truly matters. Within 48 hours, Bradley was completely blacklisted. His name became entirely toxic. He tried to reach out to his old fraternity brothers for emergency loans. They did not return his calls. He tried to apply for entry-level consulting jobs at downtown firms just to secure a basic income to stop the financial bleeding. His resume was tossed into the trash the moment it crossed any human resources desk. He went from a smug, arrogant golden child playing real estate mogul to a broke, unemployable pariah who could not even afford a cup of coffee. He was effectively exiled from the only world he had ever cared about. While Bradley was being erased from the corporate world, William Sterling and I were executing the legal mechanisms of our contract with ruthless mechanical efficiency. The investment advance agreement my parents had signed without reading a single page was airtight. The contract clearly stipulated that the $2 million advance was strictly contingent upon the wedding taking place and the absolute absence of any financial fraud. By explicitly lying about their financial standing to me and to Chloe's family, and by failing to produce the wedding that the funds were supposedly designated for, they had triggered every single default clause in the document. We did not need to negotiate. We did not need to go to trial. They had willingly, voluntarily put up all of their remaining assets as cross-collateral for the cash, because they had breached the contract and could not repay the funds upon immediate recall. Those assets now legally belonged to my estate. My father had secretly taken out a massive $800,000 second mortgage on his Oak Brook house to cover Bradley's past failures. Now that entire fragile structure collapsed under the weight of his own greed. William filed the default judgments and coordinated directly with the bank holding the second mortgage. The foreclosure process was initiated immediately. There was no grace period. There was no room for emotional pleas or extended deadlines. My father desperately tried to hire a lawyer to fight it, but no reputable attorney would take the case once they read the contract he had willingly signed and notarized. The law was absolute, and numbers do not care about your ego. 3 weeks later, the final eviction notices were served. I did not go to Oak Brook to watch it happen. I had no desire to look at their faces ever again. But William's legal associates were there to oversee the asset seizure, and they reported back to me with clinical detail. The process was a public, humiliating spectacle. The luxury vehicles my parents loved to parade around town, the sleek silver sedan and the expensive imported SUV, were loaded onto flatbed tow trucks right in the driveway and hauled away to be liquidated. Then came the eviction from the house itself. Richard and Susan Myers, the people who had looked down their noses at my modest car and my simple clothes, were formally removed from the sprawling 5-bedroom estate they had ruled for decades. They were forced to pack whatever clothes and personal items they could fit into cardboard moving boxes while bank representatives stood in their grand foyer, changing the locks on the heavy oak doors. Their wealthy neighbors, the people they had tried so desperately to impress, closed their custom blinds and looked the other way. Nobody offered them a guest house. Nobody invited them to stay. The church friends my mother had gossiped with completely abandoned them, pretending they had never associated with such scandalous people. Without the luxury cars, without the prestigious country club membership, and without their pristine credit, they had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. I received a copy of their new address from the final court filings. They had been forced to rent a tiny dark 2-bedroom apartment in a run-down, crumbling complex on the far industrial edge of the city. It was the exact kind of neighborhood they used to lock their car doors when driving through. Now it was their permanent reality. The building had peeling paint and a broken security gate. Bradley had to move into the small second bedroom with them sleeping on a cheap mattress because he had absolutely no money to rent a place of his own. The Golden family was finally living exactly the life their actions had earned. As their world crumbled into dust, my phone began to fill with desperate messages. In the beginning, the voicemails were full of that familiar, arrogant rage. Richard would yell into the receiver, demanding that I stop this nonsense and drop the legal claims immediately. He tried to command me to fix the mess, as if I were still the obedient child living under his roof. Susan would leave long, shrieking messages, calling me an ungrateful monster, accusing me of destroying the family over a simple misunderstanding. I did not respond. I did not react. I just let the silence stretch. Then, as the cold reality of their eviction and total bankruptcy finally set in, the anger dissolved into sheer, pathetic panic. The tone changed completely. The demands turned into begging. They realized that their manipulation tactics no longer worked, and they were terrified. One evening, I sat on my couch watching the rain wash over my quiet street and decided to listen to the final voicemail my mother had left. I pressed play, purely out of clinical curiosity, wanting to hear what a defeated narcissist sounded like. Sarah, her voice was trembling, weak, and broken by actual real tears. "Sarah, please, you have to call us back. We have nothing left. We are living in a horrible, dirty apartment. The heating barely works. Bradley cannot find a job anywhere, and his creditors are calling constantly. Your father looks so old and tired. His pride is completely gone. We know we made mistakes, Sarah. We know we were wrong about Lily's money. We were just so scared of losing everything, and we panicked. Please, Sarah, you are my daughter. You cannot just leave us here like this in the cold. Have mercy on us. We need you. Please, pick up the phone." I sat perfectly still, listening to the sound of her crying echo in my quiet living room. She was begging for mercy. She was begging for the exact same compassion and protection she had denied her own dying granddaughter. She wanted me to save her because she was my mother, and she believed that biological title meant I owed her my loyalty. But being a mother is a sacred title, earned through love, sacrifice, and fierce protection. She had forfeited that title a long time ago when she chose greed over her own family. I thought about Lily. I thought about the days I spent holding her small hand while the chemotherapy ravaged her little body. I thought about the courage my daughter showed every single day and the vile, calculating way my parents had spoken about her in her final hours. I felt absolutely nothing for the woman crying on the recording. The space in my heart where my parents and my brother used to be was not empty. It was filled with the beautiful, enduring memory of my sweet, brave Lily. I did not owe these strangers a single drop of mercy. The debt had been paid in full. I deleted the voicemail. I opened my phone settings and permanently blocked Richard, Susan, and Bradley from ever contacting me again. I closed my laptop, turned off the living room lamp, and walked down the hallway to my bedroom. The house was quiet and safe. The storm was finally over, and for the first time in my life, I was completely, totally free. It has been exactly 6 months since the day I walked out of that opulent country club and left my parents sitting in the ruins of their own greed. Today, the Chicago weather is unexpectedly warm and forgiving. The brutal, freezing winds of winter have finally surrendered to the soft, gentle breezes of late spring. I drove to the cemetery this morning, with the windows rolled down, listening to the quiet hum of the city waking up. I was not rushing. I was not panicking. For the first time in what feels like an entire lifetime, my chest was not tight with anxiety. I carried a massive bouquet of brightly colored daisies. They were not the expensive, imported white orchids my mother had obsessed over for that ridiculous country club party. They were simple, joyful, and beautifully vibrant. They were Lily's absolute favorite flowers. I walked up the gentle, grassy hill toward her resting place. The green blades of grass brushed softly against my shoes. When I reached her headstone, I knelt down and placed the daisies carefully against the smooth, polished granite. I traced the carved letters of her name with my fingertips. I did not cry the heavy, agonizing tears of a broken woman anymore. The tears that fell today were entirely different. They were quiet and warm, born from a place of deep, enduring love, rather than desperate, suffocating grief. I sat there on the soft grass for a very long time, simply talking to my daughter. I told her about the changing seasons. I told her about the small stray cat I had started feeding on my back porch. I told her how much I missed her laugh, echoing down the hallway. And then I told her exactly what I had done with the money that was meant for her care. That $2 million trust fund was legally mine after my parents forfeited their claim through their own blinding arrogance. But sitting in my quiet house, looking at those massive funds in my bank account, I knew I could never spend a single dime of it on myself. That money represented my little girl's suffering. It represented the agonizing hospital stays, the endless medical treatments, and the sheer terrifying reality of fighting a pediatric illness. It was completely sacred. It was not meant to buy a larger house or luxury cars or expensive vacations. It was meant to bring comfort in the darkest moments of life. So I took every single penny of that $2 million and I used it to establish the Lily Foundation for Pediatric Care. I worked closely with William Sterling to set up the legal framework, ensuring the charity was completely bulletproof and immune to any outside interference. The mission of the foundation is incredibly simple and deeply personal to my heart. We provide immediate, direct financial relief to mothers and fathers who are genuinely fighting to save their sick children. When you have a child in the pediatric oncology ward, your entire world suddenly stops. You lose your job because you are sleeping in a hard plastic hospital chair every single night. The bills pile up on your kitchen counter like a mountain. You constantly worry about how you will pay for groceries or keep the electricity running while you are desperately praying for your child to survive the night. It is a level of stress that completely breaks people. My foundation steps directly into that terrifying gap. We pay the mortgages so families do not lose their homes. We cover the utility bills so the heat stays on. We buy the groceries and provide the transportation funds for endless hospital visits. Just last week, I sat down with a young mother whose 5-year-old son is battling aggressive leukemia. She was utterly terrified because she was about to be evicted from her small apartment. She wept in my office, telling me she felt like an absolute failure because she could not work and care for her sick boy at the same time. I handed her a certified check that covered her rent for the next entire year. I looked her directly in the eyes and told her that her only job in this world was to hold her little boy's hand. I told her that my Lily was looking out for them. The pure, overwhelming relief on that mother's face was worth more than all the country club memberships and designer clothes in the entire world. That is my daughter's true legacy. She is no longer here with me, but her beautiful, enduring spirit is out there right now, keeping the lights on for families walking through the darkest valley imaginable. Building this foundation and rebuilding my own shattered soul has given me a significant amount of time to deeply reflect on the nature of family. Society places a massive, heavy burden on us when it comes to the people who happen to share our blood. We are conditioned from the moment we are born to believe that family is an unbreakable, absolute bond. We are told repeatedly that we must always forgive our parents, no matter what they do. We are lectured that we must always honor our siblings, and that blood is thicker than water. People use these empty phrases like weapons to keep victims trapped in endless cycles of emotional abuse and financial exploitation. Society demands that you keep walking back into the burning house just because the people holding the matches share your last name. For 32 years, I believed those toxic lies. I genuinely believed that if I was just accommodating enough, if I just shrank myself down small enough, my parents would eventually realize my value and love me. I thought my role as a dutiful daughter meant absorbing their casual cruelty and smiling bravely through the pain. I allowed them to treat me like a disposable background asset because I was terrified of being entirely alone. I let my mother belittle me. I let my father prioritize my brother at every turn. I made excuses for their terrible behavior because facing the truth was simply too painful. But walking away from my parents and my brother taught me the most profound, liberating lesson of my entire life. Sharing DNA with someone does not give them a permanent license to exploit you. Biology does not grant anyone the undeniable right to abuse you, belittle you, or completely steal your peace of mind. A shared last name is not a free pass to treat another human being like absolute garbage. You do not owe your sanity to people who repeatedly demonstrate that they do not care if you survive. People in my extended family often reach out and ask me if I have forgiven my parents yet. They tell me that holding on to anger is a poison and that I need to let it go for my own health. The concept of forgiveness is so deeply misunderstood in our culture. People mistakenly think forgiveness means immediate reconciliation. They think it means inviting toxic people back to your dinner table, ignoring their past actions, and pretending the history of abuse never happened. They want you to sweep the pain under the rug so everyone else can feel comfortable at Thanksgiving dinner. That is not true forgiveness. That is simply a willing return to the slaughterhouse. The ultimate form of true forgiveness is freeing yourself entirely from their toxic grip and refusing to play their sick games ever again. I have forgiven my parents in the sense that I no longer carry the heavy burning weight of constant anger in my chest. I do not wake up in the morning wishing them physical harm. I do not spend my precious energy plotting their continued downfall. I do not monitor their lives or check up on their miseries. Their own bleak reality is absolute punishment enough. They are living in a cramped, run-down apartment, completely consumed by insurmountable debt and entirely isolated from the wealthy society they worshipped like a religion. Bradley cannot find a decent job in his industry. Richard cannot show his face at his former country club. Susan cannot brag to her socialite friends. They have to wake up every single day and look at each other, knowing they threw away a loyal, loving daughter who would have gladly supported them just to fund a shallow wedding scam that ultimately destroyed them. I forgave them by simply cutting the invisible emotional strings they used to manipulate me for 3 decades. I placed a boundary made of solid, immovable steel between my peaceful life and their chaotic, miserable existence. I no longer jump when my phone rings. I no longer panic about disappointing them. I wake up every morning in a quiet, safe house. I pour my coffee. I listen to the birds singing in my backyard, and I go to work helping families who truly need it. My life is rich and full and incredibly calm. I finally learned how to protect my own heart. I look out at the beautiful, vibrant daisies, resting gently against Lily's granite headstone. The sun is shining brightly now, casting a warm golden light over the green grass of the cemetery. I take a deep, clean breath of the fresh spring air, filling my lungs completely. I am no longer the terrified, grieving woman weeping on a hardwood floor in an oversized sweater. I am no longer the forgotten sister or the unappreciated daughter. I am a successful professional, a fierce protector of my daughter's beautiful memory, and a woman who finally learned her own absolute worth. I stand up slowly, smoothing my dark dress. I brush the loose grass from my knees and whisper a final quiet, loving goodbye to my sweet girl before turning to walk confidently back down the hill toward my car. I share this deeply personal story today, not to gain your pity, but to offer you validation. I know with absolute certainty that there are so many people listening right now who are carrying the exact same heavy burden I carried for decades. You have been told that you are the problem. You have been called overly sensitive or dramatic just for asking to be treated with basic human respect. You have been drained emotionally and financially by the very people who were supposed to protect you. Sometimes the most painful lessons come from the people we call family. If you have ever had to cut off toxic relatives to protect your own peace and sanity, hit that like button and subscribe to support this channel. And please drop a comment below and let me know, where are you watching from right now and what time is it there? Your support gives people like me the strength to stand up for the truth. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next story.